in the forgotten folds of an ancient forest, where sunlight moved slowly through layers of whispering leaves and dew never quite dried, there lived a fairy girl named Ilenia. She was not the sort of fairy you find in painted books or twinkling cartoons. No, Ilenia was of the older kind, woven from spider silk and twilight, her wings brushed with dusk and the scent of wet bark. Her voice was soft, almost sighing, like the last breeze that follows after a storm has passed. Ilenia did not live in a mushroom or under a rose petal, but in a hollow of an old yew tree whose roots curled like sleeping serpents into the mossy earth. She had no family as far as she remembered, and perhaps she didn't need one. Her companions were the slow-growing ferns and the silent moths who flew only in the coolest hours of the night. Birds rarely noticed her, though sometimes robins cocked their heads and stared, sensing something at the edge of their knowing. The forest she called home was called Brindledip, not by humans, for they had long forgotten this place, but by the trees themselves. They whispered it through their bark and sang it through their branches when the wind passed. It was the kind of forest where time forgot to count properly. Days melted into each other. No clocks, no footsteps, only the constant hush of green. Things growing. Ilenia spent her days in ritual. She polished snail shells with her fingertips, gathered droplets from leaves to sip, and watched the shifting patterns of ants and beetles. She never wore shoes. Her feet were always damp and cool, stained with earth and lichen. One morning, the morning is a soft word here. For Brindledip had no real mornings. Ilenia wandered deeper into the woods than she ever had. She had followed a procession of black butterflies, each with wings as velvety as soot, drawn to the strange way they danced in a slow spiral through the mist. Eventually, the butterflies dispersed, vanishing like dreams on waking. But Ilenia had reached a part of the forest she did not know. Here, the trees were broader, their roots more twisted. The moss on the ground grew in thick, bouncy carpets. It felt like stepping on the breath of the earth itself. And that's when she saw it, a rock dot, but not just any rock. This one was tall, most her height and round at the top, like a slumbering head. Its surface was covered in thick, soft moss, greener than any she had ever touched, and damp with a kind of breathing moisture. It sat alone in a clearing, surrounded by an almost perfect circle of mushrooms. The rock didn't move. It didn't glow. It didn't hum or whisper in any magical way. It just was. But Ilenia stopped in her tracks. Her small heart fluttered in her chest, and not with fear. There was something about the stone that made her feel, noticed, as if all the stillness in Brindledip had been waiting for her too. Find this. She stepped closer, and though her feet left no sound, the mossy clearing felt as though it listened. The air became heavier, warmer, like the inside of a sleeping beast. Alenia placed her hand gently on the stone's surface. The moss yielded slightly beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes. It was cool, alive, comforting. She sat down beside it, curled her legs to her chest, and leaned against its mossy flank. And for the first time in a long time, Alenia spoke aloud. Hello. Of course, the rock didn't respond. But something did stir inside her, feeling she could not name, soft and peculiar. A feeling that made her want to stay. And so she did. Not just that day, but the next and the one after. Days passed like shadows. Alenia returned to the stone again and again, telling its stories in her quiet way. Stories of her dreams, her questions, and her little discoveries in Brindledip. She wove necklaces of beetle wings and hung them gently over the top of the rock. She sang to it in the rain. She tucked feathers into its moss and once even cried against it when a baby squirrel she had been watching was taken by an owl. The stone was her anchor. It never answered, never changed, but it listened, and that, she thought, was enough. Yet one evening, deep into the stillness of twilight, she noticed something. The moss had grown slightly on one side. It had crept upward in a curl that looked very faintly like a smile. Alenia tilted her head. She touched the spot. Was it her imagination? She did not know, but that night, as the moon filtered through the leaves in dim patches of silver, Alenia lay beside the stone with her wings curled tightly around her body and whispered, "Do you know me?" And in the stillness, though nothing moved, she felt just for a moment as if something inside the stone did know her, as if it had always known her. Or maybe, perhaps it once had a name. But what kind of rock has a name? And who had it been before it had become stone? Echoes beneath the moss by now. The mossy stone was more than just a resting place. It had become something Alenia could not explain, not even to the whispering ferns or the bark-catched beetles who scuttled up to her tiny toes. She still did not know if it could truly hear her. She still wasn't sure if the little smile in the moss had been real. But in her heart shaped from stardust and thistleflower she believed something ancient and kind lived deep beneath that stone's surface. Each day Alenia returned. She would greet it with her small voice, sometimes croaky from sleep, other times carried on a sleepy song. She would bring bits of beauty, curled shells from the stream, fallen petals from trumpet flowers, feathers that caught golden light just right. She never asked the stone to speak back. It didn't need to. Its silence was safe, its stillness sacred. But then came a night unlike the others, a night when Brindledip itself seemed restless. It began with a change in the air. The ferns didn't unfurl in their usual sleepy spirals. The moss didn't glisten with dew. Even the moth, her usual nighttime companions, remained tucked tightly beneath bark and stone. Elinia, curious and calm, walked barefoot through the forest as usual, her wings folded neatly behind her. But when she reached the mossy stone, she stopped short. Something was different. The moss was dry. The rock no longer smelled of rain and wood smoke, but instead of dust, hollow stone. Time. She knelt, pressing her ear to its cool flank, and where once she had imagined slow heartbeats, there was now only emptiness, awaiting silence, deeper than any she'd ever known. She felt her chest tighten. Had she imagined it all? Had her heart been pouring itself into a piece of earth that never truly cared? She sat beside it in silence for a long time. So long, in fact, that even the sun grew tired of waiting and slipped beyond the horizon. The moon rose half asleep and filtered its bluish light across the clearing, and then so faint it might have been a trick of wind. She heard it, a whisper, not a word, not even a syllable, just dot, 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 a sound, a low murmur like water beneath stone, ancient, slow, comforting. Elenia stood suddenly, startled. Her wings trembled slightly in the moonlight. She pressed both hands to the mossy surface. "You spoke," she breathed. The rock, of course, did not answer. But now, the moss was glowing, faintly, as if lit from within. The glow pulsed like breath, and the whisper came again this time. Clearer, still not a voice, exactly. More like memory. A sound carved into the heart of the forest long before Elenia had ever taken flight. It told no story, and yet she understood. It had not always been a rock. The realization bloomed in her chest like a slow-growing vine. This stone, this presence she had sat beside and whispered to for so many quiet hours, had once been someone. She closed her eyes. A name floated just beyond her reach, like pollen in spring wind. And in that moment, she knew the truth, not with her mind, but with her heart. The mossy rock had once been a boy, not a fairy. Not a man, but a quiet boy, long ago lost in Brindledip. Maybe he had wandered too far. Maybe the forest had whispered too softly, or not at all. And maybe when no one came looking, he had chosen not to leave. Or perhaps the forest, in its slow old way, had simply kept him. Time had folded him inward. His thoughts had slowed. His body had stilled, and he had become stone, still, listening, dreaming, waiting, waiting, waiting. Lee sat again. Softly, she whispered, "Were you lonely?" The moss pulsed, once, then faded. That night, she did not go back to her hollow in the yew tree. Instead, she curled herself around the stone's base, like a fox might curl around its den. Her wings wrapped around her like a blanket. She felt the moss against her cheek. It was warm again. She dreamed not of her usual things, not of beetles or feathers or clouds shaped like bear paws. No, this dream was older in her sleep. She saw a boy, barefoot, walking through the forest. He had moss in his hair and twigs tangled in his shirt. His eyes were not sad, just ... quiet, like someone who had spent many seasons listening. And though he never spoke, he reached out his hand. In the dream, Elenia took it. Together, they walked through Brindledip, past the fern groves, past the stream, past the places even she had not dared explore. When she awoke, the moss beneath her was damp with dew. The birds had returned. The moths fluttered nearby. The forest, it seemed, was breathing normally again. She turned to the rock. It looked exactly as it always had, but she smiled, because now she knew this was not just stone. It was memory. It was waiting. It was love, shaped by time. And slowly, Elenia began to speak again, with stories or songs. Did you laugh often? Were you ever afraid? Do you still dream? She did not expect answers. But sometimes, in the hush between one breeze and the next, the moss would curl just slightly, or the glow would return for a moment, or the whisper would rise again, low and distant, like wind through dry reeds. Elenia never grew tired of waiting, because some love stories aren't rushed. Some unfold slower than moss, deeper than stone, and she had all the time in the world. The whisper of forever in the last light of the setting sun. The clearing where the mossy rock lived glowed, as if kissed by memory. Dew clung to the grass like glass beads, and the fairy girl, Alira, stood quietly, watching the rock as she had 1,000 times before, but tonight felt different. A hush had fallen over the forest knot, the silence of absence, but the stillness that comes just before something ancient wakes. Alira had spent countless nights sitting by the rock, listening to its warmth, feeling its moss breathe gently beneath her fingertips, as though the earth itself had a heartbeat. It had been seasons since she first laid eyes on the peculiar green stone, shaped like a great reclining animal, and covered with a moss so soft that it cradled her like down feathers. She remembered how strange her feelings had been at first, embarrassing. Even a fairy falling in love with a rock. But it hadn't been just a rock, had it? Each time she visited, the rock felt more alive. Not in the way trees or birds or insects lived, but in its own slow, listening way. Sometimes the moss pulsed with the forest's energy. Other times, when she sang, she felt a faint tremble in its surface-like laughter deep beneath soil. And when she cried, the moss felt wet with tears, not just her own, now. As twilight crept in, Elira stood for the final time, as she had the night she first whispered her love aloud. "I want to understand you," she said softly, kneeling beside it, her wings folded gently down her back. "I've spent a year telling you all my thoughts, my stories, my memories, but I've never heard your own." The wind stirred the leaves above, and a light rain began to fall. Not enough to send her flying for cover, just enough to blur the world into soft edges. And that's when it happened. A glow began at the base of the moss, upright. Not sharp, just a gentle hum of greenish gold. The moss curled slightly, like fingers uncurling after a long sleep. Then a deep, earthy sigh rose from the rock knot, a voice exactly, but a feeling that filled her chest. It was as if the forest itself was speaking through memory. Elira leaned forward, placing her palm on the moss. "Are you ... awake?" The warmth that responded wasn't hot or cold, but ancient. It carried weight, as though it had been gathering meaning for centuries. The moss shifted once more, and for the first time she felt the rock pulse once, slowly, like the heartbeat of a mountain. "You heard me all along, didn't you?" There was no answer in words, but in the rustle of the trees, in the hum of the moss, in the damp breath of the earth, she felt yes in the days that followed. The other fairies noticed a change in Elira. She didn't flit about the sky as much, or gather berries with the others. Instead, she spent her time planting ferns near the mossy rock. She brought tiny pebbles in her satchel, polished and round, gathered from the nearby stream, and placed them in careful rings around the base. Her wings shimmered dimmer now, not from sadness, but from something deeper, introspection. The queen of the glen summoned her one morning. "You have not joined the night flights in weeks, Elira," said the queen, perched atop a toadstool throne, carved from birch bark and pine resin. Elira bowed, eyes downcast. I've been tending to something dot 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 or someone. I cannot explain it well. The queen studied her for a long time, then said gently, "We've always known you were different. Even as a hatchling, you spoke to stones and listened to rivers." "Do you think it's wrong," Elira asked, "to love a rock?" The queen chuckled, then grew thoughtful. "The earth is older than all of us, child. Who are we to say what is worthy of devotion?" The turning point came with the great flood. 4 days, rain lashed the forest. The river overflowed, sweeping through the glade with merciless force. Trees were torn up by the roots. The burrows of small animals were drowned. Even some fairy homes were lost. Elira, perched beneath a cluster of mushrooms, watched helplessly as her beloved mossy stone disappeared beneath a wave of churning brown water. When the rain stopped and the sun returned, Elira flew over the wreckage. Her eyes scanned the clearing, mud-streaked and broken. The rock was gone. No moss, no green, no heartbeat. Only a wound in the earth where the forest had been. She fell to her knees in the soft silt. Her breath came in shallow gasps, wings drooping behind her like folded parchment. Had she dreamed it all? For 3 days, Elira wandered. She flew low and slow, following the river's course as it curved through the broken woods. She passed tree trunks split like thunderclaps, and once beautiful glades now turned to murky pools. But she did not stop until she reached the bend where the river split into 2 fingers. There, lodged, halfway up the bank, tilted awkwardly but unmistakably, was the rock. Its moss was tattered. The glowing lichen was gone. But the shape, the subtle curve of its back, and the indent where Elira once sat that was still there. Elira landed gently upon its slanted side. She placed her palm against it, cold. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, and she whispered, "You're still here." And then faintly, barely noticeably, thrum, a beat. The moss would take time to regrow. The forest would rebuild. But the rock remained, and it remembered. Over the seasons, Elira became the guardian of the glade. Though the forest grew thick with new life, the clearing where the mossy rock now rested, tilted, and scarred, was kept clear. Ferns circled it once more. Flowers grew around its edges. Birds came to rest nearby. And Elira was always there. She no longer sought the approval of her kind. She no longer flew as high or as fast as she once had, but her wings remained, as did her heart sometimes. Young fairies asked her why she stayed beside a broken stone. She would smile and say, "Because love doesn't need to speak or move to be real. Sometimes it just listens." And on certain nights, when the wind was just right, and the moss shimmered in the moonlight. Some claimed they could hear a low, pulsing hum like the heartbeat of the world itself, echoing through stone dot, and always Elira would be there, resting against it, beneath the stars, beneath the quiet, beneath the forever that only moss and stone can understand. The clockmaker's daughter and the river that forgot time, the village that always heard ticking in a quiet crook of the world, where no maps dared detail and no birds sang songs too loud, lay the village of Quailing. It was wrapped in mist most. Days, with roofs like old shawls slumped over sleepy homes, and cobbled streets worn smooth by the soft, deliberate steps of generations past. It was not a place one stumbled upon, it was a place forgotten by time, though time itself was measured carefully in every corner. For you see, Quailen was a village ruled by clocks. The ticking was constant, everywhere, soft, stern, or sonorous clocks, of every size and shape, lined the walls of the shops, the posts of street corners, the halls of the town library, and the mantelpieces of even the poorest homes. It was said a child was not considered born until their own pocket watch had been wound. And it was also said that death came only after one's last clock wound down, as if souls, like machines, needed to be counted to the end. At the heart of this strange village was the clockmaker, Master Elowen, and his daughter, Isala. Isala was quiet like the morning mist. She never shouted, never rushed. Her words, when spoken, seemed to arrive from a long distance, as if crossing an ocean of thought. She had dark, heavy eyes and long fingers used to shaping gears, so small they could be mistaken for breadcrumbs. She spent most of her days in the back room of her father's clock shop, listening to the harmonies of chimes and pendulums. Elowen, her father, was a man of rust and wisdom, with silver hair that seemed to have sprouted like cobwebs over time. He had crafted time for others his whole life, built it, shaped it, mended it. Yet even he would sometimes pause and whisper, "Time is a brittle thread, Isla. It snaps in strange places." It was not an ordinary village life she lived. She did not walk with schoolmates or braid flower chains in the summer grass. Isla grew up adjusting escapements and balancing pendulums. She once told a traveling priest that the stars above moved not by the will of heaven, but because somewhere, someone had wound a very large clock. But there was one thing even her father never taught her to fix. The river Ervan ran along the edge of Quailen, sometimes calmly murmuring, sometimes gurgling in fits, but always flowing in one direction, until one year, when it didn't dot, it was the spring Isala turned 17, and the willows were just starting to stretch open again, like old men shaking off winter's cold. She noticed it first while fetching water in the morning. The river had stopped moving, not frozen, not dried, just still. As if it had forgotten something essential. Birds hovered above it, confused. A single leaf, caught on the surface, did not drift. When she dipped her bucket in, the water didn't splash. It entered the vessel soundlessly, almost reluctantly, like honey losing its purpose. By noon, word had spread. Villagers gathered along the riverbank, muttering, poking the water with sticks, whispering about curses and broken rites. Some old women crossed themselves with dried lavender. Others blamed the bridge, as they often did when they needed something to blame. But Isola stood still, her fingers twitching at her side, as though she was calculating a missing cog in her mind. Time is a brittle thread. That night, she asked her, "Father, what if a river forgets how to move?" Elowin looked up from a disassembled cuckoo clock, his brows rising like curtains parting. "Rivers don't forget," he said slowly. "They carry memory in their motion. A river that stops is a heart that no longer beats. Can you fix it?" She asked. "I make things small," he replied. "Rivers are not mine to wind." That night, as all the clocks in the village chimed midnight, dozens of them, some in harmony, some far from Irisala, lay awake. The sound was no longer comforting. She found herself holding her breath between ticks, waiting for something to give. The pause between seconds had become unbearably long, and then, as if summoned, she heard something impossible. The ticking stopped, not everywhere, but in her father's shop. One of the clocks had fallen silent. She crept downstairs, barefoot and careful. It was the brass pendulum clock with the cracked face, an old piece that had once hung in the manor house before its roof caved in. She'd oiled it herself not 3 days before. Its hands had stopped at 11:47. She stared at it for a long time, then checked another. 11:47. Another. 11:47. Her own pocket dash watch. 11:47. But the clock tower outside rang 12. Isala stepped into the street. It was not raining, though it smelled as if it had just finished. The village was cloaked in a darker hush than usual. The air tasted old. She made her way to the river. Tea was still unmoving, but now something else had changed. A shape stood on the far bank. A girl. She looked nearly identical to Isola. Same dark hair, same posture, but she was clothed not in the soot-smeared apron of a clockmaker's daughter, but in something mossy and wet, as if sewn from the river itself. The girl lifted her hand and pointed to the water, Isala, half dreaming, stepped into the SHALLOWS. She felt nothing, not cold, not wet, not motion. She was walking into stillness. And as she took another step, the river's surface shimmered beneath her like a memory being remembered. Then the figure across the river whispered, not with her voice, but into her mind, "The clocks lie. Come where there is no ticking." The moment shattered like thin glass. Isala blinked. The girl was gone. The river remained still, and behind her the ticking had returned. But she now knew this was not a mechanical problem. This was a story, and stories, unlike clocks, could not be mended with gears. Where water dreams in loops by morning, the river still held its breath. Isala sat at the breakfast table, staring at her tea as it cooled in silence. Even the boiling kettle had sounded less lively today. The quiet had grown deeper than before. It was not the stillness of dawn or fog, but something buried deeper, like a room long locked and recently opened. Her father was oiling the teeth of a grandfather clock. But he paused, glanced at her. "You didn't sleep." "I did," she replied, too quickly. "Not well. Neither did time," he muttered. I heard the ticking stutter again. Isala stared out the window. The river had always been the village's edge, the end of the known. No one had ever crossed it, not for generations. It was just a rule, accepted like gravity or fire. The river marked the last heartbeat of quailing. Now it marked silence. The girl from the night before haunted her thoughts. Was she a dream, a reflection, a warning? Isala wasn't sure, but her voice had carved itself into her memory. "The clocks lie. Come where there is no ticking." She couldn't let it go. Later that morning, when her father left to deliver a repaired chime to the town chapel, Isala stole away. She slipped her smallest tools into a leather pouch, fastened her walking cloak, and tucked her pocket watch into her satchel. Still frozen at 11:47, that too had to mean something. She walked the same path to the river's edge, the path her feet already knew too well. The mist hung low, like a curtain hiding the stage. She stepped to the same spot where the figure had stood the night before. The river looked different, still unmoving, but stranger now, like glass over a deep well of memory. "I'm here," Isala whispered. "Tell me what you meant." For a moment, nothing answered Daunt. Then her own reflection shimmered in. The water drew back. It receded, teeted, silently, like a dream unspooling. The riverbed, slick and mossy, was suddenly visible like a path winding beneath the surface. She hesitated, then stepped forward. No splash. No sound. The water curled around her ankles, but left no trace of wetness. It was like walking through silk dot then, just as suddenly, the world bent. The riverbed twisted underfoot, spiraling downward like a helix. For a breathless second, she feared she might fall not, downward, but outward, into somewhere the world had hidden. When her feet found solid ground again, she stood in a place that felt both real and not. The trees here were impossibly tall and slow-moving, as if swaying in invisible tides. Their leaves shimmered like coins under candlelight. The air was heavy with scent of wet iron, old books, and clock oil, and before her flowed a new river. This one moved, but in loops. It flowed upstream, then sideways, then doubled back in spirals, as if time itself were confused. Across the water stood a house, old and wooden, built on stilts, with clocks nailed all over its walls, but none of them ticked from its porch. The river girl watched. She was clearer now, no longer a dream, but made of moss, mist, and memory. Her eyes were old, far older than her face. "You came," the girl said. Her voice was gentle, but it echoed like it had passed through centuries. "I had to," Isala replied. "The river, it's broken." The girl tilted her head. "No, it's remembering." "Remembering what?" The girl stepped aside, gesturing toward the house. "Come, you need to see." Isala crossed the footbridge, feeling the planks shift beneath her. The water below spun like thought loops, returning always to their beginning. Inside the house was time, but unraveled. There were clocks everywhere, but all their hands spun backward or hovered in place. Some melted slightly at the edges. A few had faces, and they blinked. On the walls hung portraits that shifted as she looked at the mold. Then young, then old again. In one, a boy played in the snow. Then he was gone, and a woman mourned at his grave. Then he returned, older than before, to find her again. "Is this real?" Isela whispered, "As real as time's memory." The girl said. She walked to a corner of the room where a large wooden door stood. A faded brass plate read, "The river's first cielos, Kama, Karasalas." Heart thumped. "I don't understand." The girl stepped closer. Long ago, this place was alive. The river ran forward. The village ticked in step with its waters. Then came the first clockmaker ancestor. Isala turned sharply. "My family." "Yes, he built the first great clock tower. And with it time became measured. That's not wrong." The girl's expression darkened. "It isn't right, either. Before, time breathed. It bent with the river, danced with moonlight. But your family caged it, tamed it, made it tick. 1, 2, 3. She stepped closer, and now the river resists. It remembers what it was before. Isala felt a chill settle around her. So, what does it want from me? The girl's mossy fingers reached into a pouch at her side. She withdrew a small, pulsing object, a clock heart, beating like a sparrow's chest. It wants to be unwound. Sala stared. She understood the mechanics. The tool she'd brought could open the gearbox. She could release the catch, let the mainspring coil unravel, but to do that, time would go wild, she whispered. The girl nodded. Clocks would die. Minutes would drift. Maybe, the girl said, or maybe time would breathe again. Isalas stepped back. But I fix things. That's who I am. I keep the world moving. No, the girl said gently. You bind it. But perhaps your gift is not in keeping time, but setting it free. Behind her, one of the clocks gave a final wheeze and stopped. The silence felt like truth. Isala closed her eyes, and for a moment she remembered how it felt to float not in time, but in possibility, before ticks, before chimes, when stories didn't need seconds. She opened her SATCHEL and reached for her tools. The day the clocks forgot to breathe, Isala's fingers trembled as she fit the tiny tool into the clock heart. It was warm alive. Somehow its gears faintly pulsing like breath, like a second heartbeat in her palm. The river girl stood beside her, silent, watching with those moss-colored eyes full of storms and memories. One click, then another, the gear teeth parted, a whisper of steam escaped, like a sigh that had waited a century to exhale. The mainspring inside the heart of all, ticking, began to uncoil. Not with fury, but grace. The sound it made was not mechanical. It was like a melody being undone. Notes folding back into silence. The heart stopped pulsing, and outside, portraits blinked out like dying stars. The gears on the ceiling wept golden tears. One by one, the timepieces slumped. Sleeping, at last, Isela felt something inside her chest unhook. A tightness she hadn't known she carried was gone. Her own heartbeat slowed, and for the first time, it did not feel caged by seconds. The river girl smiled. You've done it. Outside, the strange river rippled. The water still flowed in loops, but they were calmer now. Less frantic, as though it had released the burden of remembering everything all at once. Isala stepped out onto the porch and looked down. The river now mirrored the sky-drifting clouds. Where clocks once clung, the bridge she had crossed had melted into lilies and old rope. How do I get back? She asked. The girl touched her hand. You never left. And then the world folded, not in a jarring collapse, but like a blanket being drawn up at bedtime. Warm, slow, gentle, she blinked and found herself back at the riverbank in Quaylin. Just as the morning bell rang from the chapel. Except the bell did not ring in its usual punctual tone. It warbled, as though it had forgotten the exact second it was meant to strike. She looked around. The river flowed again. Not in loops, not backward, but gently forward, as it had not done in 100 years. Children pointed at it. Elders stood at its edge, stunned. Time, once contained, now wandered freely again. Isala walked home in a daze. Her satchel was light. The clock heart was gone at the clock shop. Her father stood staring at the long-case timepiece that guarded their front room. It stopped, he murmured. This old beast hasn't stopped in 47 years. She smiled faintly. It needed a nap. He turned to her, something uncertain in his eyes. The village clock tower rang early, then again late, and I swear the bakery sundial turned counterclockwise. He reached out and touched her cheek. You've been somewhere, haven't you? She nodded to where the ticking ends. In the days that followed, Quaylin softened. Clocks still worked, but no longer ruled. People missed appointments and didn't mind. Children played in puddles without worrying about bedtime bells. Old stories returned off seasons, moons, river songs, and Isalua Sala became a different kind of clockmaker. She no longer wound clocks to bind them. She repaired them when they were tired, not just broken. She invented tiny devices that measured laughter or the time it took for dew to melt. She built a clock that only ran when someone missed someone else. And she visited the river often. It no longer spoke in stilled silence. It hummed. Sometimes she saw the Mossy girl again. Sometimes not. But always she felt her. One evening, Isalas stood beside the river as the sun fell behind the woods. She held a new device in her hansa. Small wooden cube with a dial, a feather, and a piece of melted clock glass inside. She whispered for remembering. She placed it gently in the reeds, and the water carried it away. The next day, the clock tower in the center of town didn't chime at all. No one noticed. Or rather, they didn't mind. They looked at the sky instead. And that was the story of the clockmaker's daughter and the river that forgot time. The girl who traded dreams with the moon, a whisper beneath a window, a village that rarely showed up on maps and never made much noise in the histories of kings or wars. There lived a girl named Elswith. Her home was stitched onto the edge of a forest where ivy hung from trees like weary thoughts, and the grass always felt cold, even in summer. She was the daughter of a weaver, and her days were folded into the soft, repetitive rhythms of loom work, thread sorting, and carrying dyed cloth down narrow, creaky stairs to hang in the dusklight. Elswith was not extraordinary. That was the most remarkable thing about her. She was not beautiful in the way minstrels sang of. No hair spun from gold or eyes like polished sapphires. Her nose had a curious crook from childhood mischief. Her fingers were always stained from berries or ink, and her voice was quiet, as though she were always speaking to a friend who was trying to sleep. The villagers liked her well enough, but they often forgot her. She was a gentle page in the book of life, easy to skip, but Elswith had one peculiarity. She could never remember her dreams, no matter how deeply she slept, or how many herbs she steeped in her bedtime tea. The dawn always arrived with an emptiness in her mind. Others in the village spoke easily of their sleeping visions. A neighbor dreamed of flying, the blacksmith of rivers made of fire, and old Merrill, the apothecary, often muttered about a staircase that led nowhere. Elswith listened to them all, like a person listening to the stories of distant lands she would never visit. But one evening in late autumn, as the hearth fire crackled with damp wood and the sky outside bloomed with the deep blue of twilight, Elswith heard something strange. It was a whisper, soft and low, like the creaking of winter branches or the rustle of feathers. It came from beneath her window, which she always left open by a sliver. Her bed faced the moon, you see, and every night she liked to lie beneath it as if it were a candle kept lit just for her. The whisper did not startle her. Instead, it settled inside her like warm honey. She rose from bed and tiptoed to the window. Pulling aside the old lace curtain her grandmother had stitched from wedding scraps. Outside, there was no wind, no fox or owl, only the moon, full and silver as an old coin. It hung low over the trees, and then the whisper came again, this time clearer. Why do you not dream, Elswith? She blinked. The voice had said her name. Her heart should have raced, but instead it beat slowly like a lullaby drum. She leaned further out the window, the cold air brushing her cheeks. I do not know, she answered softly, but I would like to. There was a long pause, and then a figure stepped from the shadow of the tallest oak. It was not a man, nor quite a woman. The figure shimmered like fog over still water, tall and cloaked, with a face that glowed like pale pearl. It did not walk. It simply was, as if it had always stood there, and she was only now seeing it. "I am a dream keeper," the figure said, "one of many. We pass through the night skies and gather the fragments of thought the world forgets. Most people never notice us, but you look at the moon like it is listening." Ellsworth swallowed. "Is it?" "Yes," said the dreamkeeper, "and it is lonely." They lifted a hand, and from their palm rose a flicker of silver mist. Within it, tiny images pulsed: a girl running through bluegrass, a door inside, tree, a cup that filled with tears and emptied with laughter. Dreams, the dreamkeeper said, are not only stories, they are trades. You give us your fears, your memories, your wishes, and we give them back, shaped into tales. But you, Ellsworth, you have been hoarding your dreams unknowingly, keeping them tucked deep where even we cannot reach. Ellsworth felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, but recognition, a feeling that she had carried a silence too long. "I want to trade," she whispered. The dreamkeeper nodded. "Then come." And before she could think to fear the cold or wonder whether she had shoes on, Ellsworth stepped out of her window onto the moonlit grass. The village behind her did not stir. The wind held its breath, and the moon above seemed to blink just once in approval. They walked without walking. That was the only way Ellsworth could later describe it. One moment, she was beneath the trees of her village, and the next she was standing in a field of slumbering flowers. They pulsed gently, opening and closing like breathing mouths, and all of them shimmered in shades she didn't have names for: bronze lilac, midnight, blue glow, moss gold. "This is the between," the dreamkeeper said. "Where traded. Dreams are kept before they are returned." Ellsworth looked around. The sky here was not black, but the deep blue of her mother's favorite dress. No stars, only slog-lighting creatures that looked like glowing paper birds. And on the horizon sat the moon, vast, close, and pulsing like a heartbeat. "Why can I come here?" she asked. "Because you asked," said the dreamkeeper. "Few do." They gestured toward a pool in the center of the meadow. It was shallow, its surface smooth as glass. "Place your hand in and give your first trade." Ellsworth knelt. The water shimmered like melted pearl. She closed her eyes and reached in. At first, there was only warmth, and then a memory, a tiny one, of her father humming a lullaby as he repaired the loom. She was 5. She had fallen asleep watching his fingers work the thread. It was not a memory she had thought of in years. And yet, as she touched the water, it bloomed full and fragrant as spring. The dreamkeeper nodded solemnly. A memory for a story, a thought for a vision. The trade is begun. Elswith opened her mouth to speak, but found herself suddenly very tired. The meadow blurred, the dreamkeeper's face folded into starlight. And the next thing she knew, she was waking up in her own bed. The lace curtain, swaying gently with the breeze. Had it all been a dream? Perhaps, except for the small blossom lying on her pillow, one she had never seen before. Its petals were moss gold. ELSWYTH began to sleep differently after that. Not deeper, not longer, but quieter, as if something inside her had been soothed. And each night she met the dreamkeeper again. They would walk together through strange landscapes, a sky where fish swam through clouds, a forest where books grew like fruit, a cave where her own laughter echoed back in unfamiliar voices. And each time she would trade a memory, a fear, a fragment of a thought. In return, she received dreams, dreams of weaving threads that turned into stars, of speaking to birds made of wind, of holding hands with the moon itself and being told secrets that melted upon waking. But what she did not yet know, what she would not understand until much later, was that the dreamkeeper had not brought her into the world of dreams for kindness alone. They had chosen her for a reason, and that reason waited patiently on the far edge of the between, in a garden of broken dreams and sleeping promises, a place few humans had ever reached, a place that whispered her name, even now. The dreamkeeper arrives. The summer deepened into a hushed kind of heather kind that kept shutters closed in the afternoons and made the river smell of moss and memory. Elira still did not sleep, but her waking nights were now filled with such vivid visions that she almost forgot she was ever dreamless. Every evening, the moon came to her quietly, not always with a voice, but with feelings, shapes, and impressions that settled on her skin like snowfall. Sometimes she dreamed of forests with trees whose leaves were shaped like feathers. Other times she found herself walking beside wolves that spoke in rhymes. There were deserts that wept, clocks that beat like hearts, oceans turned upside down. They were strange, beautiful, lonely dreams, but never scary. She felt ... seen, but something had changed in the dreams. A shadow began to appear at the edges. Not a monster or a ghost, just a figure, a woman, always standing at a distance, always watching and always silent. Elira mentioned it to the moon one night, tracing the pattern of stars through her attic window. "She's not one of your dreams," she said quietly. "Is she?" There was a long pause. Then came a ripple of unease, like wind across still water. No, she is awake. Alira felt her breath catch. Who is she? The one who once held what I now carry. The keeper of dreams. She is old, and she is coming. Elira was silent. Is she angry? The moon did not answer. Instead, it dimmed slightly behind a wisp of cloud, as though reluctant to go on. 3 days later, the stranger arrived. She did not come by road or river. No one saw her enter the village. One moment, the stone bench beside the fountain was empty. The next, she was sitting there, hands folded neatly, silver hair pinned in loops, eyes the color of sleep-deep oceans. The villagers didn't question it. Perhaps it was the weather, or her voice, which could soothe dogs to silence and lull even restless infants. They simply began to call her Madame Elia, a visiting herbalist, someone claimed, or an astronomer. No one really knew, but Alira knew. The first time they passed each other in the field where poppies tangled with wild thyme. The woman smiled. "You're the one who hums to the moon," she said. Alira's heart thudded. "You know about the dreams?" The woman tilted her head. "I know you've borrowed what was never yours, and I know you're not to blame. But child, even the moon forgets its promises." Alira frowned. "I didn't take anything. We traded. I gave it pieces of my heart." Madame Elia's eyes softened, but it was not kindness. It was pity. "Oh, sweet girl, that is not how it works. Dreams are not currency. They are seeds. Once moved, they sprout in places they were never meant to grow. You must come with me." Lyra stepped back, the grass cool beneath her feet. "Where?" "To undo the tangle, to return what the moon should never have kept. Not out of fear, but sorrow. If I return the dreams," she whispered, "will I sleep? Perhaps, and the moon, it will forget you." The weight of those words settled into her chest like stones in a riverbed. She turned without another word and walked away. That night, the moon rose red. Alira had never seen it like that, bruised, trembling, as though exhausted from lifting the sky. Its voice was slow when it reached her. "She is right. I am breaking. Ira stood in her attic, fists clenched. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I loved you, and I was tired. And you were the only one who listened." Tears came unbidden. She had never known the moon could lie, but perhaps it hadn't lied, only withheld. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, "nor I you. But dreams are not ours to hoard." Even in love, there was a long silence between them, and then she will take you to the place where dreams are born. You must choose, return them, or keep one, only one, and then sleep forever. The attic went still. Illyra sat for a long time, watching the moon tremble, and when dawn came, she went to find Madame Elia. They journeyed far, not on foot, but in a way that felt like falling sideways through time. Madame Elia led her through the village orchard, past the blackberry bushes and the bee-loud hives, and into a grove where the shadows bent oddly like reflections in water. Beyond the grove was a hill Illyra had never seen before. It seemed unremarkably. Ilea raised a hand, and the grass parted like curtains. Beneath the hill was a staircase made of glass and bone. No dream passes here twice, said Elia. Be careful what you remember. They descended. It was neither cold nor warm below, but something else, like standing in a story before it was told. The air shimmered. Sounds flitted past her ears. Laughter, sobs, lullabies, the shuffle, a snap of a feather, and light. So many lights, each one hovered like a firefly, pulsing softly. Some flickered in pairs. Others danced in loops. A few hung still and sad. These, Elia whispered, are the dreams you were given. The ones that never reached their rightful. Sleepers, you must choose. Give them back, or keep one and sleep forever. Illyra stepped forward. Breath shallow. The dreams stirred. A child flying on the back of a carp across stormy skies. Ah, lonely baker whose hands glowed when he sang. A girl who lived in a clock and made time for people who lost it. And others, thousands of them, bits of soul, lost pieces. Illyra walked among them slowly, and then she saw it, a small, quiet dream resting in a shadow. One she remembered well. It was a mossy glade lit by moonlight. She was lying there, not wandering, not wandering. Just resting, sleeping for the first time. It wasn't the most exciting dream, or the most magical, but it was hers. The one the moon had tried to give back night after night. The one she had never been ready to keep. She turned to Elia. If I return the rest, can I keep this one? The woman nodded. You may, and with it, you will finally sleep. But you will forget the moon. Illyra looked at the quiet light in her palm and nodded. They rose before dawn. The dreams swirled upward, drifting into the skies, drawn toward those they had long waited for. Elia watched them go with a tired kind of joy. Elira held her single dream close. It felt warm. She thanked the woman, then walked home through the orchard, the grove, the fields she knew. The sun had not yet risen. When she reached her cottage, her mother was asleep by the hearth. Elira kissed her brow gently, then climbed to the attic for the last time. The moon was gone. It had set early. Sensing what she had done, she lay down. Beneath her quilt, closed her eyes, ... And finally, she slept, but somewhere far away, on a hill lit only by wind and memory. The grass still parted at the sound of footsteps, a place that whispered her name even now. The night, the moon remembered years past, and the village forgot. Elira grew older, quietly and peacefully, her days filled with ordinary rhythms, helping her mother mend clothes, tending herbs in the sun, watching clouds drift by with sleepy contentment. She became known as a gentle soul with a faraway look in her eyes and an uncanny way of calming even the most fretful children. When people asked about her dreams, she only smiled. "They are nothing special," she would say, though sometimes she couldn't remember them at all. She no longer climbed to the attic window. The moon, once so near, now felt like something glimpsed through a veil, distant and silent. Elira never searched the night sky for its face, nor did it speak to her again. But once in a while, when the wind rustled a certain way, or when the scent of crushed lavender hung in the air just so, she'd feel a soft ache in her chest. Not sorrow, not longing, just ... The memory of something beloved that she no longer remembered. The dream she had kept, the single one she chose, stayed with her every night. A gentle place in a mossy glade where she simply rested beneath a glowing sky. In that dream, she never moved, never spoke, but she always awoke with her heart full. Time moved on, slow and kind, and far above, the moon watched in the realm of dreams, where clouds bloom like lilies and stars drift like seeds. The moon stirred restlessly. It had grown quiet since Elira's return. No longer weighed down by stolen dreams, it had space again to breathe. And yet, the moon ached, not because of the loss of dreams, but because of her. The girl who had once hummed lullabies in her attic. The girl who listened when no one else did. The girl who gave her heart in pieces just to keep another soul company. The moon had kept its promise, and in exchange, the moon had given up its bond with her. But something remained, a thin, silvery thread. No, more than a feeling still shimmered between them. Not enough to call her name, not enough to dream with her, but enough to remember. The moon turned in its ancient path and reached deep into the place where its light folds into shadow. There, tucked behind a forgotten dream of wolves and rhymes, lay the last gift it had never sent, not a dream, Not a memory, a story, one not yet told. On the eve of her 23rd spring, Elira awoke before dawn with a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't pain or fear. It was ... anticipation. She rose, barefoot, and stepped outside, following a pull she couldn't name. The path through the meadow glowed faintly, lit by dew and something else, something older. It led her past the orchard, the poppy field, the blackberry thickets, and toward the grove where dreams had once passed between worlds. She hadn't walked this way in years, and yet her feet remembered. There was no staircase now. No, Madame Elia, only a hush, as if the world was waiting, and in the center of the grove, where the moonlight struck silver through the canopy, sat a small glass bowl. Inside it, a folded slip of parchment. Elira stepped forward on the parchment. In a hand she didn't recognize, but somehow knew, were 5 words for the girl who listened. She opened it, and the world changed. Suddenly, she was back in the attic, but it wasn't her attic nod anymore. The moonlight was liquid, the walls breathing slowly, the air shimmering with old lullabies. And there, sitting on the windowsill, was the moon. Not a face, not a voice, just a shape of light and memory. And it whispered to her not with words, but with the feeling of wind through long grass, of pages turning, of music in the distance. You are not forgotten. Elira stepped forward. I thought you couldn't speak to me anymore. The light pulsed. I promised to forget you, but I did not. Promise to forget what you gave. Elira touched the edge of the window. Then, why now? The moon seemed to shimmer with hesitation, then resolve, because even dreams can be returned twice. From the folds of light, something rose, single dream. One Elira did not recognize. It hovered, unsure. This is yours. A dream you gave me before you knew how to dream. A seed. Do you want it back? Elira reached out. The dream bloomed, open. It was her young, again. No more than 6 or 7, standing beneath the stars with tears in her eyes. Spring to the night. I wish someone would talk to me. Just once. Throat tightened. This dream wasn't magic. It wasn't a glade or a forest or a castle in the clouds. It was loneliness, and the soft, stubborn hope that loneliness would not last forever. She took it gently in her hands. Yes, she said, I want this one back. She woke in her bed, sunlight glowing at the edge of the quilt. The dream was gone, but something had changed. She no longer felt only peace. She felt a quiet, humming courage. She still dreamed of the mossy glade, but Now it had a path running through it, a place to walk, a place to go. And in the distance, sometimes she thought she heard someone humming. She began to write against small things at first, then stories, then songs. People came to hear them. Children gathered in her garden to listen to her tales. Old men brought her cider in exchange for bedtime verses. She never spoke of the moon. But on clear nights, when the silver light spilled across the meadow, she'd nod to the sky and whisper, "Thank you." And high above, the moon circled on, still old. A girl who once traded her dreams had learned something even the stars often forget, that the quietest dreams, those born from sorrow, whispered by children to an indifferent sky, often the ones the moon remembers forever. How an Andean girl whispered to her llamas by moonlight the path beneath the mountain sky. And these are not quiet, but they are still. The silence of these mountains is not the absence of sound, but the layering of quiet things, distant stone. Rolling down a slope, a condor's wing slicing air without noise, the hush of breath on a cold morning, and the whisper of wind through it too grass. It was beneath this stillness that little Emma lived, in a highland village where no tree grew taller. Then a shoulder and the stars came down to the rooftops at night. YMA was born in a place the world forgot. Her village clung to a steep fold of the mountains, like a spider on a loom. The houses were round and low, their walls built of fieldstone, their roofs thatched in golden straw. There were perhaps 40 people in the whole community, and nearly as many llamas. The llamas, in fact, were more visible, moving like spirit shapes across the ridgelines, their silhouettes cut out against the sharp lines of sky and snow. Emma was small for her age. Her feet were calloused from walking barefoot across dry stone, and her cheeks were always red from the wind. Her grandmother often said she had the eyes of a creature that had been here before, quiet and knowing. She spoke little, but when she did, people listened. She had a way of turning her head sharply, like the vicucas that watched from the distance, alert and wide-eyed. But Emma did not watch the world so much as listen to it. By the time she was 9, she had become her family's primary llama-herder. This was not a particularly glorious job. It required waking before dawn, putting on a thick wool poncho, chewing a few coca leaves to wake the senses, and heading into the thin air with a walking stick and a pouch of dried maize. The llamas grazed along high slopes, ever restless, stubborn and aloof. Herding them was a bit like coaxing shadows to behave. They moved on their own terms, and if they wandered too far, they might not come back. Yet the llamas followed Emma. They came when she called, softly, almost under her breath. They halted when she placed a hand in the air. The villagers took notice, though no one said much. Llamas were never quite tame, and certainly not obedient. But Emma's heard 6 woolly creatures of various size and attitude seemed to trust her. They did not spit. They did not kick. They even waited when she stopped to rest. Emma did not speak Quechua to them, nor Spanish, nor even the language of sounds that some herders use, clicks and whistles and claps. Instead, she used a sort of murmur, not quite a word, not quite a tune, a breathy, rhythmical sound, like wind sighing through cracked walls. It made no sense to her family, and no one could remember being taught it. But it worked. Emma had always done it, even as a toddler, sitting in the doorway, mimicking the noises of the breeze or the buzz of lowland bees. She would go up with the llamas each morning past the terrace walls of old potato fields, beyond the stone cairns that marked the Inca trails. Sometimes she sang to them softly, especially when the mist rolled in from the mountain passes. And sometimes she was quiet, letting the breath of the land fill her ears. The llamas would graze, ears flicking, their wool brushing against shrubs, like lazy brooms at night. When the llamas lay down in their pens and the hearth fires glowed in the homes, Emma's grandmother would tell her stories, half true, about a piece the mountain spirits, how each peak had its own mood, about Mama Quilla, the moon goddess who watched over women and dreams, about Pachamama, the earth mother who could give life or take it, depending on whether you remembered to say thank you. Emma listened. One night, as the moon was climbing high and cold, her grandmother leaned close and said, "They say the llamas can understand us if we speak the language of before, the one used before the Inca kings, before the Spanish came with their bells and papers." Emma looked up. Her fingers were curled around a carved gourd used for storing salt. Her grandmother smiled, not unkindly. "Of course, no one remembers it, not really. But perhaps some people hear echoes." The girl didn't answer. She only looked away, toward the corner of the room where the shadows deepened into the shape of a crouching llama. It was carved from stone, an ancient idol, found years ago in a field and brought into the house for good luck. Its eyes were blank and patient. The next day, she followed the same path into the hills, but something felt different. The wind was colder, and the clouds seemed lower. Came YMA climbed higher than usual, toward an old ruin marked only by broken stones and tufts of moss. There was a ring of weathered walls, barely knee-high, and the remains of an old irrigation channel. The llamas halted without command, sniffing the air. It was here that Emma sat down. She folded her poncho around her and watched the sky turn silver blue. The moon had not yet risen, but she could feel it behind the peaks, its cold pull, like a thread tugging at her chest. Then, for no reason she could name, she began to hum. It was not a song, not one she knew. It had no beginning, no melody, just a breath shaped by instinct, built from silence and stone and sky. The sound wove through the ruins like smoke. The llamas turned toward her all at once, and then they came, all 6, walking in slow procession, forming a loose half-circle around her. They made no noise. One by one, they lay down. And there, under the mountain stars, Emma whispered to them, not in words, but in that same airy, ancient rhythm. Her fingers brushed their wool, and their large eyes blinked once, slowly. The moment passed like a feather on the wind. The llamas rose again. One nibbled at a dry bush. Another flicked its tail. The sky deepened to indigo. Emma stood and walked home. She said nothing to her grandmother that night. But she dreamed of stone circles and rivers that talked, of moonlight pooling on fur, of a voice that echoed her own, far older, far quieter, far deeper. The next day, the village elder came to see her. He had heard that the llamas were especially calm in her care. He asked if she would take 3 more animals, young ones, not yet used to herding. Their mothers had died in a rockfall. They were shy and moody, but perhaps she could train them. Emma only nodded. She was not surprised. The wind had already told her they were coming, and when she took them out, days later when they followed her, with hesitant steps and flicking ears, she whispered again, the same tune, the same knot song, same shape of breath. The highlands had always been quiet, but now the silence whispered back. The moon that listened as the days unfurled like woven thread through the valley. Emma's herd grew not just in number, but in something harder to name. The new young llamas, once timid and wild-eyed, had begun to mirror the older ones. They moved in step. They came to her call. They even lay down near her when she rested under the shadow of a boulder or beneath the thin shade of a twisted quenua tree. The villagers noticed that there was quiet talk, of course. Not suspicion, nothing sharp, but a soft curiosity, like the way people talk about dreams they don't fully remember. The older women said she was blessed by Pachamama, that the mountain spirit had chosen her to keep the llama safe. Some said perhaps a spirit of the past had taken a liking to her. The men said less, though they watched her closely, especially when she passed with her animals in tidy rows behind her. Emma herself said nothing. She listened, always, not just to the gossip, but to the land, the wind, the subtle shifts in cloud and light. She noticed when the birds left early before a storm. She noticed when the llamas tilted their heads toward a ridge before an echo came. She could sense when the earth had changed beneath her, even before the sun reached that spot in the morning. There were secrets in the land, and Ima moved through them like someone who remembered how to read. It was on a cold evening with a moon nearly full that she first saw the figure. She had led the herd farther than usual that day, toward a high basin where snow lingered even in summer. There was no path, just animal tracks and the memory of old trails. Her boots were thin and patched, and her fingers had turned pink beneath her shawl. But the air was so still, so clear, that it made her feel like she was walking inside a dream. The llamas had paused near a stream, dipping their lips into the icy water. Ima stood nearby, watching a hawk turn in slow circles above the rocks. Then she saw her dot. At first, she thought it was another herder, a girl not much older than herself, sitting on a stone with a woven cloth wrapped around her shoulders. But as Ima stepped closer, the figure did not move, and when she called out softly, instinctively, the girl turned her head and vanished. There was no place to hide, no cave, no dip in the land, only the empty stone. Ima did not run. She stood still, staring until the moon rose behind the pass and silvered the stones. That night, at the hearth, her grandmother looked at her for a long time. "You've seen something," she said, stirring the thick potato stew. Ima nodded. Slowly, sometimes the past visits the present if you're quiet enough, if your spirit listens. Ima wanted to ask who the girl was, but some part of her already knew. The girl had been part of the land. Not a ghost, not exactly, but a memory, curled up in time, unfolding like a leaf after rain. Perhaps she had once walked this same trail. Perhaps she too had whispered to llamas beneath the moon. The next few days passed in silence, but something inside Ima had shifted. She began to hear more clearly, not with her ears, but with something quieter. The rocks beneath her feet seemed to hum. The mountains seemed to breathe. And one night, she dreamed of a temple in the clouds. It was a circular place made of dark stone and hung with red cloth. The walls were carved with spirals and symbols she didn't understand, but they felt familiar. Llamas stood in a ring, their eyes like pools of dark water. And in the center stood the girl, the one from the high basin. She did not speak, but her mouth formed a word. Ima woke with a start. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the coals glowed faintly beneath the ashes. Her grandmother snored softly nearby. Outside, the wind moved in a hush, and the moon was full and bright, casting shadows against the walls. Emma rose, barefoot, and stepped outside. She walked past the houses, past the pens, up the slope that led to the old ruins. Her shawl flapped behind her, and her breath steamed in the cold. There, waiting on the ridge, were her llamas, all of them awake, standing in stillness, ears alert, facing the sky. She joined them, her feet tingling in the cold soil. She said, nothing but the old rhythm rose again in her chest, the knot song, the whisper. She hummed it slowly, letting it flow into the silence. And then the moon began to move, not in the sky, but on the ground. A pale beam stretched out like a finger of light, pointing toward a place on the far slope one she had never dared to explore. It was steep, shadowed, full of loose rocks and thorns. No herder went there. It was said to be too wild, but the llamas began to walk, slowly, carefully, one after another, toward that slope, toward the light. Emma followed. They crossed a narrow ridge and came to a cluster of stones, half buried, overgrown, ancient. She recognized the curve of walls, the worn edges of steps. It had once been a shrine, not Incan, but older. Something from before. In the center of the ruin was a hollow, not deep, not wide, but lined with perfectly placed stone. At the bottom, moonlight pooled like water. YMA knelt. She whispered again. The air grew still. Even the wind seemed to wait, and then she heard it. Not her own voice, to wind, but the girl's voice, soft, distant, like a dream whispered through time. It said her name, Mimend. Then, in a language older than Quechua, it sang. It was a lullaby, slow and aching, and Emma wept, though she did not know why. The llamas stood around her, forming a perfect circle, their bodies silent and strong. The moon pulsed like a drumbeat in the sky, and when the song faded, when only silence remained, Emma knew she had been chosen, not even by gods, but by the memory of the land itself. By something older than language, something that lived in stone and snow and wool. She walked home at dawn, the llamas behind her. The sun touched the peaks with gold. When she reached the village, her grandmother met her at the gate. You found it, she said. Why Ma did not ask how she knew. She simply nodded. Her grandmother placed a hand on her shoulder. Then you must remember it, all of it, for the others, for those who forget. Emma closed her eyes. She could still hear the voice, distant but clear, singing to the rhythm of her heart. She had become part of the mountain's memory, a thread in the great weave of time. The one who listened back years past, though Emma hardly noticed them the way others did. She still looked like a girl to most who saw her in the market wiry, quiet, always surrounded by her animals like stars around a planet. But those who knew her well began to call her La Pastor del Eco, the shepherdess of echoes, not because her voice was loud, but because the mountains seemed to whisper back when she walked. The villagers accepted it in the way Andean villages always had, with a shrug, a blessing, and a story they'd tell after chewing coca leaves by the fire. It was just Emma's way. The llamas followed her like shadows. The babies were born healthy. Her wool was the softest, cleanest in 3 valleys. You could argue with a merchant, but never with a mountain girl who could sing to animals under the moon. Still, Emma carried a weight she didn't always share. It wasn't loneliness, though she often slept alone. High in the cliffs, but something like responsibility. A duty not only to the herd, but to the land, and to the girl she'd once seen in the snow. She visited the shrine often, not always by moonlight, and not always to whisper. Sometimes she sat in silence, listening to the wind. Sometimes she traced her fingers along the ancient stones, memorizing the way time had shaped them. Other times she sang not in Quechua, not in Spanish, but in the soft, rounded syllables she remembered from the voice that had called her name once. She brought her grandmother, who stood at the edge of the hollow and placed a small coca leaf in the earth. She came to me, too. Her grandmother whispered, "When I was little, but I was afraid. I ran. You didn't." Emma looked up at the old woman's face, weathered, strong, more lined than the valley itself. "I think I was born for this," she said. "No," her grandmother smiled. "You listened for it. That's not the same. The seasons changed. The llamas aged, and new ones came. A boy in the village tried to court her once, with a string of dyed beads and a nervous poem, but Emma only smiled and shook her head. He didn't understand silence. He didn't watch the wind. She wished him well and never saw him again. Her days settled into a rhythm. The dawn walk with the herd, the midday weaving beneath a chulpa tree, the quiet treks into forgotten folds of land, following old stone walls covered in moss. She mapped nothing, but remembered everything. Sometimes, when a thunderstorm threatened, she'd hum the ancient melody, and the llamas would kneel before the lightning cracked. Once, when a lost child wandered from the village, it was her oldest llama who found the boy curled beneath a bush and stood over him until Emma came. And yet, it was the shrine that called her back most of all. One winter, the snow came early, not gentle, not soft, but in long, white knives that buried even the tallest stones. The llamas shivered, and even Imma felt the cold in her bones. She lit fires near the corral. She burned Yareta moss for warmth. She prayed not to the saints in the chapel, but to the mountain itself. The shrine, she feared, would be lost under the weight of snow. But one night, the wind died. The moon rose, fat and heavy, hanging like a silver drum in the sky. And Imma heard the voice again clearer than ever. Not a song this time, but a single sentence. It is time. She did not hesitate. She wrapped herself in her thickest shawl, packed dried potatoes and water in a sling, and set out with her oldest llama, Wara, who had walked with her since she was small. The snow reached her knees, her breath stung. But she walked for hours, cutting through the wind until the land fell quiet, and then, beneath the moon's light, the shrine appeared uncovered, not a trace of snow. As if the sky itself had cleared. The stones in the hollow, the moonlight shimmered like before. But this time it pulsed. It glowed with a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. Imma stepped forward and knelt. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she spoke not in whisper, not in song, but in her own voice. I am here. The wind shifted, a soft sound, footsteps, breath, memory, moved around her. She opened her eyes. The girl stood before her again, not older, not younger, exactly as she had appeared the first time. But now her face was clearer, smooth, full of grace, her hair woven with beads of bone and silver. She wore no shoes. Her cloak moved without wind. You heard me, the girl said. I always did, Imma replied. The girl stepped forward. She touched Imma's forehead with one finger. You are the bridge, she said. You carry what was forgotten. Imma didn't speak. She felt it then, not knowledge, exactly, but memory, flowing into her like water through cracked stone. Images, sounds, the weight of centuries. Herding roots once used by 100 generations. Sacred markers lost in grass. Songs of weaving. Burial chants. Star maps. A language with no writing. A life held in silence, passed through women, through the land, through the breath of animals and snow. She gasped, not from pain, but from the vastness of it, when she opened her eyes again. In the hollow, the moonlight faded, but the memory did not. Imma walked back that night with fire in her chest and quiet tears on her cheeks. The next day, she wove not just a cloth, but a story. She used colors no one else used, deep, wild reds from crushed cochineal. Soft, strange blues from rare flowers she'd crushed with stone. Black from smoked stones, mixed with snowmelt. She wove stars. She wove llamas. She wove the spiral of the shrine. She wove the face of the girl. When she hung the cloth in the village square, no one said a word. They simply looked, and in their silence, something shifted. People began to remember, not facts, not names, but feelings, the way the land had once spoken, the way their grandmothers hummed lullabies without words. The old trail's children stopped using. The wind that turned just before lightning struck. The hollow behind the ridge that had once been a meeting place, and Ema kept walking. She became old. Her hair silvered. Her fingers stiffened, but her voice never broke. She still hummed the lullabies. She still whispered to the llamas. And when the moon rose, full and round, the youngest girls would climb the path to where she sat near the shrine. They'd sit with her. They'd watch her weave, and they would listen, because the land still whispered, and someone must always answer.